welcome to another episode of Tell Us More About That. Today we have a police science doctor.
Good job. We have Suzanne Knabe-Nicol.
I think you said it right.
I think I got it right. Probably still not perfect, but close. So she started an organization called the Police Science Doctor. And I came across her website and her work through a number of people kind of in the evidence-based law enforcement, investigative interviewing community. Reached out to her, and she was willing to get on a call with us and have a conversation. So,
from the UK.
Yeah, she's from the UK. It's Saturday morning here for us, so this is our first Saturday morning interview, but we were able to work the timing out, so she took time out of her weekend to sit down and have a conversation with us, which is a lot of fun.
Well, and the point of our podcast in general is to bring kind of more niche psychology topics to people who might not normally have these conversations. And so this conversation about investigative interviewing and police techniques and police science was something that is very intimidating for me and not a conversation I would normally throw myself into. But this was a very approachable and very informational conversation that we had with her.
Yeah, she is a wealth of information. She's got a lot of experience in law enforcement over in the UK and as an academic, and has her PhD in investigative psychology. So we talked even a little bit about what that is. It's not something that's as common in the States. I think the concept of it is represented in a couple different positions that we talk about that as well, but just a really unique background and a passionate drive to enhance the field of law enforcement and provide the practitioners with the tools necessary to really be as effective as possible in their roles. We are excited to introduce you, unless you already know of, Dr. Suzanne Knabe-Nicol.
I think you said that different both times.
You're right.
Knabe.
Dr. Suzanne Knabe-Nicol. Enjoy. Welcome to another episode of Tell Us More About That. Today we have an exciting guest, and it's kind of unique because this is, I think, our first Saturday interview.
Yeah.
Which was difficult to get Jen up, even though it's 10 a.m.
Out of bed, yeah.
But our guest is located in the UK, so she is a number of hours ahead of us. I think like 6 hours ahead of us. But today we have Suzanne Knabe-Nicol.
Not bad.
Did I get it? Not bad. Not great, but not bad. Well, welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you very much.
So I came across Suzanne through just kind of most of the things that I'm reading online when it comes to evidence-based research with law enforcement, specifically with investigative interviewing. And I came across her organization, the Police Science Doctor, which she's going to talk about in detail. I reached out to her. I think I just shot you an email, or maybe it was on LinkedIn, but she responded in pretty short order, which was great, and was open to having a conversation. So thanks for taking the time on a Saturday nonetheless, and we're excited to learn more about your organization.
Well, thanks for not being a spam email. That's why I responded.
Yeah, that's fair.
That is fair.
We get our fair share of those. So if you would provide, you want to introduce yourself for the audience?
So you mentioned Police Science Doctor. I'm sure we'll talk a bit about that. So that's just a website that is educational for law enforcement, connecting research to the practitioners and the front runners. I'm currently working as a lecturer at Middlesex University in London, UK. I teach policing, investigations, and investigative psychology to criminology students, undergraduate and postgraduate level. I don't know if you guys have these distinctions as well. Undergraduate and postgraduate, but bachelor's and master's. Mm-hmm. I've got a background in policing here in the UK in various police forces for over 10 years. They were all civilian roles, but different kinds of roles. And I might have a confusing accent to you guys over there. It's probably both British and German. So German born, to Polish parents, and I came to the UK after my A-levels and studied and worked here ever since. So my entire adult life has been in England.
So you worked. Can you give a little bit more color on the types of roles that you had within law enforcement? I know you said they weren't sworn, but I know you did play some interesting roles.
So the very first one was what we call a police community support officer. They do actually wear a police uniform, still a civilian roles, and they do. They're more link between police officers and the public. So they do almost everything that the police do, but they don't arrest. They can't hand out fines, so it's more community liaison. That was the first role I did, and I absolutely hated it. Turns out I hate being in uniform. I hate walking the streets, getting on a bus. Everybody turns around and knows exactly what I do. I didn't like being on display in that sense at all. But I did that job whilst waiting to get a place at university to do my master's in investigative psychology. So it was always going to be temporary. After that, when I had done my studying, I then started working as a regional intelligence analyst for 5 different police forces in the southwest of England. After that, I became a researcher in the major crime unit in a constabulary in the east of England, and I stayed in that constabulary and the neighbouring one for my role as an investigator, which is where I did suspect interviewing, which was very interesting because I had done all the reading, studying at university in theory, and now I was doing it in person, and not many people get to do that, so that was really good. And then I started some more evidence-based policing roles where we did evaluations and projects and pilot studies and things like that.
Wow.
That was me in terms of policing, unless I forget something. I don't think I do. But most of them.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you've had an opportunity to be involved in a lot of different areas within law enforcement, which I think is unique, at least in the respect of what the standard career in the States within law enforcement looks like. Most people tend to have a relatively similar trajectory, whether they start, and these would be sworn is what I'm speaking to, but they start in, as a beat cop, sworn in their early 20s, and then they stay essentially doing the same thing. Some of them may work their way up into some type of command staff position, but there's not as much movement and trying out the different areas and kind of niches within the industry as it sounds like you've gotten exposure.
Yeah, that's possibly because, a number of reasons. One is, as a civilian, you don't get that many options to do different interesting policing roles over here yet. We are civilianizing more and more because civilians are cheaper. You don't have to pay them as much as sworn officers. You can't cancel their rest days. You can't cancel their leave, for example. But you don't have the same career options as an officer. As an officer, we've got normal officer, constable, sergeant, inspector, chief inspector, and so on. But you can work in so many different fields in policing. It's, you can specialize in victim support. You can go into the tactical units. You can do the adrenaline stuff. You can do the caring stuff. As a civilian, and that's what I found so frustrating as an investigator, I was interviewing suspect up to a certain level, and then the detectives took over, above that. Whereas I think, well, hang on, with my background, why shouldn't I be able to interview them? So that's one of the reasons why I hopped, and also because I got bored. I learn a new job and get out of it what I can, and then I move on because don't think I can learn anymore. The police didn't let me use my investigative psychology background much. I did offer when I was doing the interviewing job, shall I maybe put on some workshops for my colleagues about detecting deception or about this or that? And I said, no, it's not your job. Don't worry about it. And that's probably what sowed the seed for, well, hang on, something needs to be done to bring all that knowledge to the people that are actually doing the job. You're telling me you're not interested in me doing that, but somebody should somewhere, somehow. And
please, yeah. Well, and that's interesting too, that you are such an accessible person within their own department, and they were still not able to allow you to do that or provide that extra training or growth for their police officers.
The problem is everybody's short-staffed, overworked, and then to get people to sit out for an hour to do a workshop that they don't see the need in, people are doing their job without it. And so it's a shame. It's an underused source, I think. And I've long been thinking and advocating that I think every police force, so that's what we call our regional departments, every police force, I think, should have an investigative psychologist in-house, because in my opinion, they should perform three roles. One is actively training staff on the latest scientific knowledge in whatever their field is. Two, they could advise on some cases that are perhaps more complex, where we don't get the top experts involved. You know, maybe those cases aren't serious enough to get the National Crime Agency involved and help with some geographic profiling or some interview advice. And three, I think they should be carrying research out in-house. I think the needs are there for this position, but I haven't been able to get anyone interested in that. And there's so many people interested in investigative psychology that, you know, there would be a pool of people to recruit and train to perform these kind of internal advisory roles and operational and training roles.
Yeah. So your use of the term investigative psychology, I think it's probably more common over there. It's definitely not as common of a profession in the States, at least to my knowledge. So forensic psychology, clinical psychology, operational psychology is kind of getting more into, I think, some of the realm of what you're getting at with job description wise. But can you give a little bit of color as to what it means to be an investigative psychologist?
Yeah, so I don't know what operational psychology is, because that you just mentioned, because that potentially it could be in any kind of industry. So I can't tell you what an investigative psychologist does, because there doesn't exist a role called investigative psychologist, unfortunately. So everyone who does study investigative psychology has to fit into some other kind of thing. So clinical psychology, so I'll give you my understanding of these terms, is people who deal with people's mental health. Experts in people's mental health. Forensic psychology is people who work with offenders in relation to their mental health. So often they will be working in secure facilities where these offenders are serving time, and they will often be called in to do risk assessments on these offenders, maybe sometimes advise in court on the level of understanding of certain actions and offences, and maybe also advise on interviews, on inactive investigations or interrogations. So we tend to call them interviews, suspect interviews or investigative interviews. And the way I always explain investigative psychology to my students is that you're using understanding of psychology in the sense of how the offender makes decisions, but also how best to deal with victims and witnesses, anything that can help in investigations. So the investigative psychology comes first. Whilst we're still doing the investigation, we try and find the offender with geographic profiling, crime analysis, crime linkage. We then interview the offender. We do offender profiling comes into it, but a scientific way of offender profiling. Once we've got the offender, we use investigative psychology and knowledge on investigative interviewing, which is your background as well, on how best to interview them. And then once they go to court and they've been convicted, then maybe they'll work with a forensic psychologist, hopefully, to work on their mental health and their offending and maybe changing their ways. So that's how I see it and explain it to students.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I hadn't heard of investigative psychology until right now, but that my brain is usually in the clinical psych avenue. So it's interesting to hear how they're all interconnected.
I really like the concept of it, and what you're saying and advocating for, of having somebody kind of embedded in a law enforcement agency in that type of position. It's almost like a psychologist consultant for the cases, for how they're going to engage with all parties involved in the investigation, and then passing it off to a specialized forensic psychologist when it gets into the legal system. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer when you're saying it. It's like, why hasn't this been a part of our criminal justice system? But I mean, at least speaking from the United States perspective, it's if you're having a hard time over there with getting this to get traction, I feel like we'll probably be having this discussion in like 2050 in the U.S. of this actually being something that would be considered. But it's a really interesting concept, and it makes a lot of sense.
Do you see in your advocacy for it, are you seeing it trend in that way, or do you feel like you're coming up against a lot of kind of closed doors and walls?
I don't see a specific trend towards investigative psychology per se, but evidence-based policing is definitely becoming more embedded. So the the way that we train policing students, so people who want to become sworn police officers, now they're getting inputs on evidence-based policing, and they have to do some kind of research piece as part of their studying, because it's now connected with an academic degree, so they get a qualification once they've finished that. So that's definitely coming into it. And I think it's quite interesting for me, because I've got my investigative psychology background and the people working in that field and researching in that field. I'm also very involved with evidence-based policing and the Society of Evidence-Based Policing. And I don't think those two realms really know that much about each other or get involved, but really it's the same thing. Evidence-based policing is not a thing in itself. It's just applying research methods and questioning what the police are doing and how they should be doing it and how they could do it better. That's what investigative psychology does. What's the best way of interviewing a suspect? Does this work better? Does that work better? What's the best way of identifying where an offender might be based on their geographic and temporal decision making? It's all about what works best, and one is a little bit more about behavior, the other one is a little bit more about everything policing related. So I think they're a little bit perhaps underconnected. I feel I'm sitting in the middle a little bit. I haven't connected them very much yet. I'm still trying to grow the whole. I call my website Police Science Doctor. So this is all about police science, which I think encompasses both.
Yeah, no, and that's actually a perfect segue for someone who's maybe hearing about it for the first time. What is the objective of Police Science Doctor? What are you providing or trying to solve for?
In essence, making policing better. We have so much research knowledge about what works in policing and what doesn't. It's frustrating to see that research knowledge is usually created mainly by academics when they do their research, and then published in journal articles, and then read by other academics who find it very interesting. And I could do a study on something like that. Well, that's great, but it doesn't actually get to the people who are doing the job. And I'm not quite sure how it works in the health system, but I think there's more of a connect of research findings being absorbed by doctors and physicians and the frontline practitioners. I think there's more of a channel for that research to be fed down. We don't really have that in policing. And that's what I'm just trying to do, to connect that piece of research, make it accessible to the frontline practitioner, the law enforcement practitioner, because they can't access academic research most of the time. Most academic research is getting better with more open access publishing, but most of it is behind a subscription paywall. So unless your organization, your university or your law enforcement organization has a subscription with this particular publisher, you can't read the full article. You can read the abstract, which is the first summary of this is what this research is about, this is how we did it, this is what we found, but they can't read the whole article, and that in itself is a problem. If research has been done and we have findings, that should be made public. So they can't access it because of the paywall or the subscription wall. If they could access it, I mean, when you read academic research articles, some of them are painfully convoluted and dry, and they're just not very accessibly written. And so the whole mission is just here's the research. Police Science Doctor just is that slide of information, that talent to try and bring it to the practitioners. And I'm trying to make it as accessible as possible. So every week I do a broadcast that is all about finding 3 bits of knowledge that has come out from this research that is somehow practical. And I always have to be careful how I word this, because I'm not saying that most of the research that's published is not usable, but a lot of it, if you're reading through all the email updates you get on what's been published, something is testing a methodology, or it's bystander behavior on this campus in Malaysia, and that's good, and it's great that it's being done, but I'm trying to say to the officer, did you know that you could do this and that might really work well? Or did you know how important this is? Or did you know that if this happens, you need to know that? So finding 3 tiny bits of information or golden nuggets in this police science field is not easy. And I'm always asking for people to send me articles if they've come across anything. And that will then turn into police science snippet that I email out with the link to the original research. Obviously, it depends on whether they can access it or not. It's down to their organization. But I just say it in a few, that those snippets videos are 5-6 minutes long. So they're very, very short. If somebody wants to know more, they can click on the link that is published on social media. It goes into the email. I have, in the beginning, before I started this teaching job, when I had more time to do that, I put together a number of explainer videos. What is evidence-based policing? Is actually the most popular one, because the London Metropolitan Police show it to their students, which is fantastic. I'm really pleased about that.
Yeah.
And
that's
many
great.
others, how to read academic research, how reliable is witness interviewing, what is geographic profiling, what is crime linkage, just this kind of stuff that people might be wondering about. So I try to make that accessible by making it quite clear what it is and explaining it in an easily understandable way.
Yeah.
Wrong time to mess up the grammar.
I think you've recognized the biggest chasm in why law enforcement is not consuming that type of information, and they're not seeking out the research. And the biggest, most obvious one is what you just brought attention to is, A, they don't even know that it exists, but B, they don't have any idea or any means as to how to access it. And then when they do access it, it's a lot of times beyond something that they even want to take the time to even try to understand how to consume it. So you've distilled it now down into, you've cut out all of the noise, and you've made, not only do they not even have to read it, and it's not that there is definitely a misperception about, especially like local law enforcement beat cops, that they don't even want to read, which is, at least in the States, which is ridiculous. They're all hungry for information. It's just they just don't know where to go or how to find it. So you've eliminated all of those roadblocks by putting it right in front of them and providing a very easy to access resource, and then also doing it in a way that they can consume very quickly. Like these shotgun videos. What did you had a almost like an online conference, didn't you, where it's like very quick, like rapid fire interviews with academics? What can you give a little bit more on what that event was?
Yeah, and just another thing about the accessibility. They're all these broadcasts are videos and podcasts as well, so you can listen to them in the car, for example. Yeah, so I had a number of online events. So there was 2 rapid fire conferences. One was that was 3 years ago. So one was on just police science, I think, and the other one was it about investigative interviewing? That's really bad that I don't remember this. There was also mental health and policing online event. And it's just amazing how much content I found to put into those conferences and events. But obviously I need to be mindful of people's time and attention span. But there's so much that could be said on any of those topics. And yeah, for the rapid fire conferences, that the brief was to ask every contributor to, prepare a 10-minute video. I think all of them were longer. But
yeah,
then
of course.
it's it's that happens, and that's fine as long as the content is good. I didn't mind it so much, and people can view the individual videos of the contributors, and they can view the whole thing on the Police Science Doctor website. So it didn't matter that much. But yeah, I was really pleased with the content that everybody provided to these events, and they're still all available to watch for free. And so it's I wish I hopefully I'll make the time again to put more of these together. I do have a new thing that I'm working on with Police Science Doctor, which is the Police Science Doctor magazine.
Oh, cool.
Oh, great.
And that is going to be international. I think most such publications are focused on their country only, and it's going to be free, again, hopefully financed by people who want to advertise their organization or course or podcast, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, in there, so that everyone can, again, to keep it accessible, it has to be free. Police officers don't even want to spend £2 or $2 on something, and I get that. If everybody was asking me for £2 here and there, you don't want to. But if it's free, it's accessible, it's a PDF, there'll be interviews, there'll be even things that policing students write about their research. So it'll be very much more grassroots and much more from the ground up and much more personable, hopefully, I think, than some of the news organizations or the news outlets that deal with policing. But it's not easy doing all of that whilst also being a full-time lecturer. But it's something that is, Police Science Doctor is something that wasn't there. It should have been there, so I put it there. And,
That's
once
awesome.
you've got a passion for something, you can't let it go, even if it's costing you lots of money and nothing is coming back. But I know that people are reading the snippets and they're appreciating them. So that's, that sort of keeps you going.
Do you, the content that is on either Police Science Doctor or the rapid fire conferences that you've put on, the content that you're putting out there, is that mostly directed at UK topics, themes, and patterns that you're seeing? Is some of it more international and sort of police force in general?
I don't think any of it is UK
like?
specific.
Okay.
Even if some or much of it has come from the UK, it's something, like you're saying, you guys are, what did you say, 15, 20 years behind. If you hear it because we're already doing or doubling in it, then great, it can be applicable to you. I mean, one of the great, this has nothing to do with Police Science Doctor, but one of the great things that I think people should start realizing is something that Professor Lawrence Sherman has put out there, which is we're all quantifying crime wrong. You can't count crime, just like we can't count diseases. There's such a qualitative difference in the harm that it causes that we should have a crime harm index and rate the seriousness and the impact of the crime rather than the count. And that's something that's new here. And I teach it in my classes. It's the very first time that students have ever heard about this, apart from the people in the know in the evidence-based policing community, especially those that, that greatly respect Professor Sherman. I don't think anyone knows about this. And so if it's brought out in the context of the evidence-based policing route from Professor Sherman or the SEBP or Police Science Doctor, so it might have started here. Professor Sherman is American, actually, but it will hopefully spread and be recognized around the world. So I don't think any of the content is UK specific. Many of the speakers were international. And policing obviously is different in many countries, but the science behind it is very similar, even though studies have to be replicated in different countries, because what we might find with geographic profiling or behavioral or offender profiling in one country might be different, especially with the geographic profiling in a different location, because people, the way that people live and the way that the environment is structured is different. So again, it gives you a starting point, though. If you're hearing that most rapists don't travel more than 2 kilometers to find a victim, or a murderer will travel far many more kilometers to dispose of a body than to actually encounter or catch the victim. That's interesting. But then do your own research or get someone to do the research in your country to see, okay, what are the distances in our country? People travel a lot more, I think, in America and Australia than they might do in something as densely populated as the UK. So even if the figures are not the same in terms of what the travel is or how long the inter-crime distances are, it's a starting point
units of
for you
measurement.
to think about that.
So one thing that you mentioned before that I kind of want to get a little bit deeper on is this idea of the whole concept of evidence-based policing. So evidence-based standards in law enforcement, the desire to find, conduct, and consume research and then actually use it in the field. So what is it that you think within law enforcement specifically that is just so ingrained on doing things the way they've been done? And now we have to kind of change what that expectation is.
I think there's probably a number of reasons for that. One is the hierarchical nature of policing, that somebody who's come up through the ranks has probably come up through the old ways of doing it, and if something new has to be done, then to question everything they've done before in the past decades that they've been serving the public might not be the most comfortable thought and idea. The other thing is that I think practitioners often feel, often justifiably so, that there's a disconnect between what academics think that they should be doing, that the practitioners should be doing, but they've never done any of that themselves. So this is, you should, I've heard that one academic said that actually you shouldn't even ask any questions in interview. The best interview is one that doesn't ask questions. Now, I didn't go into that because it wasn't me who was speaking to the academic, but then the officer will be thinking, well, what do you mean? How is that supposed to work? And, when they were first told a few decades ago, you should always be nice and respectful to your suspect, which is the law here. It's not necessarily the law in America. they were also thinking, yeah, but
there.
suspects, they are like this, they treat us this way. So there is a disconnect with what is best to do, with what you should be doing. Like, I don't know, do you know the show Super Nanny?
No.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
So it's a lady that I think it started here, and she goes into people's houses and helps them with the problems with their children, and I think it's fantastic. She doesn't have any children herself, though, and sometimes it's easier for you to, and it's very easy for me to give everyone else advice on how to deal with their relationships and their children, but maybe I wouldn't take my own advice in my own life. So and that's why it was very important to me that I have this policing background, that I have actually done the job, and that I have interviewed suspects, and I have talked to people whilst I was in uniform on the street. I've done the community policing, to then say, actually, well, I do know, I do have an insight of what it is. I haven't been doing it for 30 years, but I do know what that's like, and I do know about the research, and I want to connect these two, because sometimes there's a distrust from the practitioners who are dealing with very difficult situations, the very difficult people all the time, to be told this is how you should be doing it. In theory, that's the best way. But the academics maybe haven't done it. Some have, and that's great, but many haven't. So I think maybe in a sense they would need to earn the trust of the practitioners first. And again, I think if there was more collaboration, then that trust could be established.
Yeah. I love that, and that's kind of what you're getting at with this idea of an investigative psychologist being embedded in a law enforcement agency, working hand in hand, and not being so disconnected and just like sending their research. It's them actually seeing firsthand and being involved. Yeah. I mentioned the term operational psychologist earlier, and that's kind of the same concept. It's a newer term, I think, designation within psychology in the States of a psychologist being embedded within the military or Department of Defense, but you also have law enforcement operational psychologists that are doing the same type of thing, where they work for the department. They're going on ride-alongs with the officers. They're involved in case, at least consultation, and they have a direct firsthand knowledge, and they're able to build trust with the law enforcement officers and agents that allows for a much more genuine and organic type of relationship. So yeah, that's interesting. From my experience being in law enforcement, I was a local law enforcement and a federal agent this was a while back now, but going through multiple academies, not once did I ever have a class or any instructor ever talk to me about evidence-based principles in law enforcement, research, where to find it, how to consume it, how to apply it. Are you seeing that that's something that's happening, at least in the UK, of kind of grassroots movement of showing them and introducing them to this concept of evidence-based principles in law enforcement, so it's something they're carrying with them throughout their careers?
It has started now. So a few years ago we changed how our police officers are being trained, and they're going through a program that is giving them a degree as well. So it's like a degree apprenticeship whilst they're studying to become a police officer, and once they qualify, they actually have a degree in something which is to acknowledge the training and expertise, and well, not expertise, but the training and the qualification they've gained in that. And that does embed evidence-based policing now, which is good. So all the newer officers are trained in it. You mentioned earlier that people become officers and they stay in this career for decades, whereas I have job hopped so much. I think we've seen a change in how long people stay in policing for a number of reasons. One is that the expectations were maybe wrong. The other one is that the level of stress involved, especially in the last few years as a police officer, with the bad media coverage that the police have had, people don't see it as a vocation anymore. It's more of a job. So they do the training. Some people leave after the training. Some people leave a few years into the job. So that has all changed now. But people are coming in with more different backgrounds. You can become so that we've got direct entry detective programs, because we are woefully short of detectives in this country. So you can train and become a detective without having been a police officer before. And that was also controversial, but more and more of evidence-based policing is being embedded in the training, and all the newer recruits have some kind of input on that. How much of that they retain and accept when they're being pumped full of information is a different matter, but at least it's not something that should be completely alien to them.
Yeah, that's huge. I told Jen before this particular interview, I was like, I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm probably going to ask most of the questions just because this is such a near and dear topic for me. So
I'm here to learn.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to overtake the interview on it, but
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
What you mentioned that police studies. Do policemen in your country have to go to college or some sort of academic path in order to become police officers?
So that's the controversy that didn't used to be the case. Then a few years ago, it was decided that you don't have to have a degree or you don't have to have been to university to become a police officer. But whilst you're learning or studying to become a police officer, whilst you're being trained, we're going to give you some academic knowledge and skills so that it's a degree apprenticeship.
Okay.
I don't know if you guys have apprenticeships, but that means the same. You're learning on the job, you're getting paid whilst you do so, and you come out with a qualification in that particular topic. So everybody who is now becoming a police officer, if they don't have a degree already, they get a degree through the apprenticeship in 3 years. And if they already have a degree, they have 2 years of additional training, so it's a little bit shorter for them. But everybody who's a new trained police officer now has a degree. So it's and that has been controversial because people didn't like the idea of the insinuation that you need to have a degree, you need to be academic to be dealing with people, to have this job, and that wasn't the purpose behind it. But also we're going back a little bit, where they did reopen that route of not going through the degree pathway and just becoming a police officer like before, that even if you haven't got a degree, that's fine, you become a police officer and you do the training for 2 years without the degree part to it. So it's possible, I don't know how many people will prefer that route, to go back to that old route that was reopened. The whole thing hasn't been completely fleshed out how exactly it should be, and it's interesting though. And I think with you can have debates about, is it necessary to do the degree aspect to be a good police officer? Is it not necessary? What's better? What's more efficient? What's more effective? Do you attract different kind of demographics and people to either the degree path or the non-degree path? I don't know, it's difficult. But yes, so at the moment most new recruits are doing a degree at the same time or already having a degree, but they have also reopened the pathway without the degree.
Oh, okay. That's what is it here? What's the pathway here?
Here it's so difficult because it's so fragmented. So there's not a like a national standard for how law enforcement officers need to be hired. Every state has their own expectation, and then there's local, state, and federal different agencies, and so every town, every sheriff's department, every city municipal department has their own standard and expectation. So it's very much a fragmented system without any type of structure, at least universal structure. So it's difficult to say. You can go to a tiny little rural town, and their hiring standards are pretty much, you fog a mirror, you can get a job, because there's only like 5 people that work at this tiny little town. And you can go to a municipal department in Richmond, Virginia, and it's incredibly competitive, and most of their officers are likely college educated, and so it's a whole laundry list of different hiring standards and expectations. It does lead me to a question though, when we're talking about research in the field of law enforcement and how to implement that research so that law enforcement can do their jobs in a more effective and efficient manner. Even before the people become law enforcement agents or officers, do you have any insight into what the research is saying around how we can effectively recruit and hire people this day and age to fill those roles so that A, they stay, right? I mean, we have the whole issue of why cops are leaving, the optics that you had mentioned, and mental health issues and everything else. But B, I think a big part of it is we're not recruiting the right people. So we're not doing an effective job of screening to ensure that we're actually bringing those right people in to fill those positions. So can you speak to that a little bit of what's changing in the recruiting side of things to improve?
Yeah, so there's a very interesting podcast episode about that I play in part to my students in class, the Reducing Crime podcast. There's an episode with a lady called Mo, and they talk about recruiting and the fact that much of police recruitment was traditionally done with high-pumped adrenaline, hanging out of a helicopter upside down, maybe with a big, I don't know, AK-47 or whatever, kicking indoors,
Sure.
throwing people into the back of a van, and that's really not what policing is about at all, really. And so you're recruiting the wrong people. You're attracting very masculine adrenaline junkies that want that power and that action, and they just want that very rudimentary feeling of that almost martial existence, when really policing is mainly mental health work now. It's communicating with people in crisis, in very difficult situations. And I have seen a big change in the recruitment where it's more about identity and doing something for the community, and that's changed a lot. And we need to recruit more diverse people. We need to recruit more women. You'll hear that on that podcast episode as well in Reducing Crime, that if there was a training course that somebody could offer that says you'll have fewer citizen complaints, you'll have fewer incidents of use of force from the police, you'll have better outcomes, you'll have more victim support, you'll have more victim engagement, then everybody would be buying that course. But actually, rather than a course, it's just recruiting more women into policing. And we only have about 30% police officers here in the UK. You guys, I think, have about 12, 13. So we're doing a little bit better. But there are countries like New Zealand and I think some of the Scandinavian countries where it's more 50-50, where things are working better in some ways. And so the recruiting has to be better aligned to the job and the skills required. And the skills, I always say, everything is psychology. Behavior is psychology, crime is psychology, how you deal with people, how we're talking to each other is psychology, how I'm formulating what I'm saying so it's got a desired effect, that's psychology. So dealing with people in crisis, in difficult situations is full of psychology, and you need emotional intelligence for that. You need to be really good at leveling with people, calming them down, talking them down, and that's what policing is. It's not so much running after someone wrestling them to the ground and, like I said, kicking indoors and slapping handcuffs on someone. And I'm very pleased that in England we have policing by consent, where we use the least amount of force and authority necessary. Our police officers aren't even armed, which must be very strange to any American police officer who would probably have a panic attack if they came out on a secondment here and were in uniform and didn't have a firearm. But I think that's good because you're starting the conflict down here. Whereas, sometimes in American policing, you see it starts here straight away. It starts with authority, hand on the gun, and you can't. I wouldn't know how to change that because such a large proportion of your population is armed. You can't tell the police officers not to take it. So I don't know how to solve that. But I'm very pleased that here, for example, the population doesn't necessarily have any weapons at all. Some people who might go hunting, which is another controversial issue, and some criminals, but the normal person has never seen a gun. So you can go in and start the conflict resolution down here with words, and then if it really escalates, well, there's some CS spray. If it gets worse than that, there's a taser, and if it really gets worse, somebody will call a firearms unit who will have to come specifically if a gun is needed. But even the firearms officers I've met, they've been carrying their gun for 20, 30 years and are very proud to say they've never even used it. One only pulled it 3 times and has never discharged it. So I forgot the original question. Sorry, I don't know how I got here.
No, that was perfect. It was about the recruiting of What's
Right.
changed
Yeah.
in order, to attract people in today's climate to do that
So you
job?
need to map out a lot better what does the role actually require, what kind of skill set do you need for people to already have or for people to learn and develop on the job and in training. And it's not running it's not running after suspects. That's really not necessary that often. Map out what the skill set is that you need, map out what kind of skills have the best outcomes for the community, and then recruit for that.
Yeah. And that's the part that I do think is uniquely different between how policing is done. And obviously there's a number of different things that are different, but in the UK and in the States, where I 100% agree that there needs to be a greater emphasis put on the emotional intelligence component of a candidate and their ability to actually articulate their way through escalated situations and utilize the relationship and that kind of empathy-based approach to diffuse kind of tense, potentially dangerous scenarios and situations versus going directly for force. But I do think in the States there is a much more ever-present danger and risk of physical altercation. And when you have someone, and that's kind of the craziest part of being a cop, is you never know when you're going to need to go hands-on with somebody. And ideally, the ones who are good and the ones who are really good with their words and are good with just their presence and making sure that they're not, even just the act of putting your hand on your gun, like you had mentioned, I mean, that's trained in academies of doing, even walking up to a traffic stop. I'm going up and you have your hand on your weapon. So you're already starting things kind of 2 steps backwards. But the ones who are really good at it, they understand how to kind of mitigate and moderate the chemistry in those interactions to create a least likely scenario of escalation.
Yeah.
But there's still always the possibility that it's going to happen. So you need to have someone who leans into not resorting to that first, but is capable of doing it should it get to that situation. And that is a really unique type of person to find.
Yeah.
All while getting paid pretty much nothing for local law enforcement. So
Yeah.
it's I feel like it's a recruiting calculus that no one has effectively really figured out quite yet.
The risk of confrontation is so much higher in the US because, like we said, that the population is armed and they're expecting the police already to behave in a certain way. But I think there is a contribution that comes from police training. I tend to not blame individuals for doing something they've been told to do. So if the training manual tells you put your hand on your weapon, that's what you need to do, then that's what you need to do, even though it already sparks confrontation in a way. But also, I mean, there are many other countries where the police are armed all the time. And I looked into this a little bit because I did a session on that for my students on international, what is policing like in different countries. And in Germany, for example, I forget the exact figures now, but in Germany they have a gun. Every police officer has a gun, but they spend a lot of their training when it comes to the gun on how not to use it, how to avoid doing that. Whereas there's very little emphasis on that in America. So you're saying that you need someone who's really good with their skills and with talking someone down and de-escalating that. But, that's rare to find or it's difficult to find. But that's what we should be looking for. That's the kind of person we should be looking for. And to change the police culture as well. Don't come in like that with authority. Come in with, okay, just a much more empathetic approach. But for that, the training would have to change. The police culture would have to change. And then slowly, once the public sees over years and years that police are coming in completely differently, they might not already be on the defensive when somebody approaches them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And your solution of having this investigative, what did we call it?
Investigative psychologist.
Investigative psychologist working hand in hand, showing them and exposing them to the research and the training and having that something be that's constant and it's a part of the culture and it's not something that they get maybe once a year or twice a year or something like that would be a really effective catalyst, I think, to get that movement going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So did you have something? I thought you were about to ask.
Going backwards a little bit, but I remember it was probably height of 2020. But I remember seeing a video of police officers, British police officers, and I was shocked by how they worked. I don't remember what the video was about, but their highest armed option was a taser. And I was shocked by that. I had never even considered that was different elsewhere. So that was just a thought that I had along the way of how different police and community interact with one another in other countries. And I have a friend that is a police officer, and I remember having hard conversations with him again in the 2020 era. But he had mentioned how surprised he was that he felt like he was half-time a police officer and half-time a social worker. He was kind of shocked by how regularly he had to deal with people's mental health and the psychology of human behavior, and the empathy that he had to show and compassion he had to show to a part of his job that he wasn't really aware in trainings or in academy that was something that he'd have to encounter so regularly. So that is interesting that we talked about that too.
And there's some research around that where they're trialing and piloting projects where a mental health worker is in the response car with the police officers and responds to calls that might potentially be mental health related, which are a very high proportion, if not almost the majority, that are actually policing related, where you have a mental health triage nurse or maybe a social worker. And so if you can't necessarily get and upskill all the police officers to have these skills, take someone with you when you're a police officer to then deal with those aspects. So the police can contain the situation, make sure nobody's at immediate risk, but to actually solve the situation, they might not have the right skill set or the right connections, nor the right procedures about how to deal with these more social and mental health issues. So that's another thing that could be done. Just for all these organizations, they should be working together to work together. Because I always feel that crime is not the problem in itself. Crime is a symptom of everything that has gone wrong before. So the whole social services, the whole mental health services, physical health services, so many people fell off that fell by the wayside. They end up in the hands of the police or come to the attention of the police. So I think all these organizations need to work together to maintain safety and security for everyone. And police are always mopping up everything else that has gone wrong, everyone that has been let down by these systems before. And they don't have the skill set. That's not what policing was initially for.
Right. Well, and all of the systems that you had just mentioned that need to be working together are all of the public service systems. So they are, like you said earlier, understaffed, under-resourced, underpaid, overworked. And so all of them, I feel like those systems are just trying to hold on tightly every day.
And it's a false economy. So, if you cut them, the problems later on will be so much bigger. And nobody wants to make that investment now in prevention of future problems, because it would cost money right now, but actually in the long term it would save a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you just touched on something that's interesting of the majority of the suspect pool that law enforcement is going to be interacting with on a daily basis, not just the general community, but the people that are going to be causing problems that they're going to have to actually, engage with directly. A lot of those individuals do suffer from some type of mental illness. So you've got the majority of a population that they're going to be dealing with that suffer from mental illness, but you've got the majority of their training that's not focused on dealing with addressing mental illness. So it's such an obvious problem that's just continuously, creating more and more and more issues and challenges. So I think this bridge concept of exposing law enforcement to research and to evidence-based practices and to more what would be considered like outside the box approaches of maybe it's not you get trained on all of these things and become a mental health expert. Maybe we bring one with you. Like even something as simple as that idea could have a lot of of legs to it, and I know it's being at least trialed in the States here as well, with some significant success. But
I don't even know if it would be like overt or acute mental illness, but like we had said, there's going to be a handful of that, absolutely. But this generational or like long-term displacement or oppression from other societal expectations that I think we call a mental illness, like we talked about in a previous podcast. Like we call it a mental illness, we call it anxiety or bipolar or whatever, but it's been decades or however long of trauma or other negative experiences that people have had that lead them down certain choices and certain pathways, and maybe we label it mental health. But if we were to look backwards, it probably makes sense in some way that people make certain choices that they make.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the victim-offender overlap is massive. Most of the offenders out there are victims. They were victimized when they were very young, they were victimized when they were growing up, and they're still being victimized, but they also offend. So and everything is cyclical. So if you don't recognize the challenges that somebody has when you're either interviewing them as a suspect, you might be misinterpreting their reticence or their hesitance or the way they respond. You might be misinterpreting that as signs of guilt or that they're hiding something. And the same with victims, because police, most of us don't understand trauma and how people respond to trauma. So then if you're interviewing a victim for a domestic assault or some kind of sexual assault, and they're being vague and they're sounding unsure and they struggle to remember, you might conclude, it didn't happen then, did it? And then you're losing that victim who was a genuine victim, and you're losing that person out of the process. They're not supporting the investigation anymore because they don't feel they were being believed, and the suspect who was being misinterpreted as well is now labeled even more as an offender because nobody believes them. They seem shifty, as very, very problematic. Not understanding the normal, genuine range of human emotions, and how they respond in certain situations and in interviews, that can completely not derail the investigation necessarily, excuse me, but lead it down the wrong path.
Yeah.
Tony's eyes just lit up. I think he could talk about what you just mentioned for weeks on end.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think that's actually a really great example, isolated but really great, powerful example of the power of evidence-based practices making their way into law enforcement. Just in the scope of investigative interviewing, cops have been trained to do at least just speaking from the United States perspective, traditionally have been trained to do a very specific type of engagement, and that is a suspect accusatory confrontational style engagement. And they utilize those skills in every type of interaction that they have, suspect, victim, witness, whoever it may be, and it's to force information from somebody. And so the problems that are caused from doing that, and now obviously there's a big change in the momentum of the way that police are conducting those interactions and those interviews, but the change is coming from an acceptance and now a hunger for what does the research say? What actually works? And trauma-informed interviewing, it works. Trauma-informed interviewing allows officers to go in with a different perspective and objective to the conversation and the way that they're handling it. So I like the concept of putting research in front of the practitioners in general on a more universal level within law enforcement is what we started this podcast about. But when we talk about let's talk examples. Investigative interviewing, you can see definitively the change in the type of information that you get in the way and the experience of the interviewee when the person goes through one versus the other. And it's a direct example of how this stuff works if it's taken seriously and really applied.
Yes, I mean, you told me before we started recording that you had spoken to Professor Lawrence Allison, and he's the expert, isn't he, on the best way of interviewing to get cooperation from a suspect. A suspect is not necessarily guilty. We don't know. That's why we're interviewing them. And it might be such a novel idea to treat every suspect with respect and humility and be on an equal level when it comes to authority and give them autonomy in interview. Even when it comes to, or especially when it comes to serious crimes and even terrorism suspects. Actually, you get a lot more from the interview if you're using these social skills and you are respecting the person, and everybody would have thought that you just need to press down on them and be really harsh, and actually the opposite is true. When you're looking at the research, you get much better outcomes if you're using a very humane style and you build rapport with them, and we just need to get that into the practitioner. So do we put the research in front of the practitioner, or do we just communicate it in a way that's really, really succinct and accessible? That's a problem as well. So if in my snippets, for example, they're very, very brief because they're called snippets, and I need to fit 3 of them onto a page. So I might just say that rapport-based interviewing gets a lot more cooperation from the suspect than traditional accusatory methods. Here's the full article. So it might be as short as that, just for someone to think, what, really? I've never heard about that. Let me click on that. Let me look a little bit more into that.
Yeah.
So how do we communicate it? That's a question. Because if now all the journals said, okay, let's make all our articles free access, open access, would you would get some people who start reading them, but most of them wouldn't, because of what we talked about earlier. They don't have the time to read lengthy, stuffy articles, and they're not written in a way that is good for communicating the outcome.
Yeah, I love that. It bridges, at least gives an opportunity for practitioners to bridge over to actually like self-learning and growing.
Yeah, it's a good way to. I think we've gone now for a little over an hour, so there's like 5 other things I wanted to talk to you about, but I don't want to keep you on a Saturday now, almost evening for you. But I guess to close it out, if for the people listening, if they want to learn more about this, where can they find you? And if they want to get involved, so if they want to contribute with either articles or being involved in whatever other events that you have coming up, where would you direct people to go?
Yeah, so there's a number of things that I would like people to get involved in. So one is, of course, the simplest thing is just read or listen to or watch the police science snippets and apply them in some way. Let it raise some interest in what the snippet says and look into it more. So, like I said, the purpose of Police Science Doctor is to make policing better. And if we can do that through these snippets, then that's fantastic. If you come across articles that you think should be in the snippets because there's something that's really practical, something that can be applied or thought about straight away, then please send me those articles. Just Google Police Science and you'll find Police Science Doctor on there, the website. I also work with experts to put together courses on whatever it is that they are experts in. So I've got the Police Science Doctor Academy, which you also find on the website, on which you've got someone like Lawrence Allison has a course on there. A very, very, very easy, accessible course. It's more of an experience really and an assessment on how you respond in critical incidents, rather than a course. Professor Ray Bull, who is a big name in the field of interviewing, has a course on investigative.
The Godfather. I said the Godfather of interviewing.
Godfather
I feel like
of interviewing, exactly.
Yeah.
There's something on cybercrime. So there's courses that are available that people can access and they do the course and they can learn from it. But also I'm looking for more experts to put their courses on the academy. So we've got one platform where they can all congregate. With the Police Science Doctor magazine that I'm hoping to launch this summer, because it's got an international flair, I want the input of international practitioners, researchers, students on this is how we do it here. Let me write something about that, and then I can interview them, and the interview can be on there and in video form and in written form. I want people to contribute with content to these magazines. I want everyone, if you're a student, a policing student, for example, and you did some really good research, or you're a practitioner, you did some great research in your police force, and that's good enough to be seen by others, but never sees the light of day because there's nowhere to publish that, then just send that in and that could be featured. There's a lot of ways of getting involved in Police Science Doctor magazine. I haven't even explored, the first one isn't even out yet. So the second one, once the first one is out, people might get ideas of, this should be in there. You could put that in there. I can write something. I can provide something, and then we can have that in the second edition. So there's lots of ways of getting involved with Police Science Doctor. And if anyone has got any questions, wants to collaborate in some way, wants to be in the magazine, wants to maybe be interviewed for the for Police Science Doctor, just get in touch. It's contact@policesciencedr.com. Google my full name, Google Police Science, you'll find me.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll put all those links in the show notes as well. And the one thing that I did after I found your website, just signing up for the email list, there's already been tons of really great informative emails that come through, even getting involved on that level. So
you say tons, it's one per week. Don't scare people, please.
No. Yeah, tons of value maybe is what I meant. Yeah, okay, no, it's you're not getting inundated with lots of emails, but
no.
I honestly do believe you have done what you're working towards doing is just such an admirable kind of mission and project, and you can tell you're very passionate about it, which is why you're being so successful with it. But I think you're actually you're onto something that it's crazy hasn't been done yet before. But the way that you're going about doing it, of bridging this gap, it is. I'm hopeful in the same way that you are that it'll catch and it'll make some waves. So, thank you for everything that you're doing, and thank you for coming on and taking some time to chat with us today. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Tell Us More About That. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform it is that you're listening to us on, and also leave us a rating and review.
If you have any topics you would like us to consider, if you have any feedback or commentary, only if it's positive, please visit www.tellusmoreaboutthat.com.
Thanks again for joining in, and we will see you next time.
See ya.